Hey there. I was inspired today by Gabrielle, who left a comment on another video of mine, and so I thought I would discuss the beginnings of my thoughts on this question of why do spiritual texts only seem to cater to spiritual folk? Now, on the surface, that may seem like a moronic question. Of course, spiritual reading material and videos cater to people who are into spirituality. I mean, you make things for the market that is likely to be interested in those things. But another way of framing this question is to ask, is it really that difficult to write inviting and spiritually conscientious books and how-to guides for people who aren't necessarily predisposed to being accepting of assertions that, on the surface, sound an awful lot like wishful thinking? Many of the professionally published and widely distributed resources have a very similar tone, a similar style. And this is a style that is inherently problematic for a lot of people who tend towards favoring hyper-rational explanations for things, who do not immediately respond to emotional plea. And these are often the same sorts of people who feel uneasy embracing statements that seem to defy reality. Now, as I've mentioned before, I don't think paganism or witchcraft is synonymous with flakiness, and yet that is a popular perspective. And it would be one thing if that sort of opinion were held exclusively by ignorant and judgmental people, whom you're never going to convince anyway, so fuck 'em. But it's also a perspective that is tentatively held by a certain subset of people who are interested in learning more about our kind of spiritual path, who do want to explore this neck of the woods, but who then drop the idea entirely when they come face to face with the particular slant with which this sort of path is often conveyed. And that's really too bad, because those sorts of people who don't naturally feel at ease in a spiritual environment or with spiritual language, and yet who are nevertheless drawn to a spiritual path, well, those are the people who are least likely to find a niche where they feel comfortable enough to begin exploring their own path, and yet who arguably would be very likely to resonate with a spiritual path that was conveyed to them, or to which they were introduced in terms that they could understand, that they could embrace. Because these are people who are pulled to spirituality despite themselves, despite having a worldview that one would really expect to serve as a barrier to exploring spirituality. And so, given this rather homogeneous tone that is used in spiritual materials that are commercially available most places, those materials then become hurdles that need to be overcome by the segment of the population that does feel uncomfortable with the concept of magical thinking. Now, in a previous video, I discussed some of what I see as the pitfalls of witchy jargon. That's not what I'm talking about here, though. First off, I think one of the major issues here is style, and the fact that a lot of witchy materials related to the sort of path I'm on, particularly 101 books, you can kind of get away from this tendency with more technical reading. But when we're talking about introductory materials, so many of them are either sickly saccharine or, quite frankly, very angsty. And my saying so might sound pretty disparaging. Having said that, I'm absolutely guilty of engaging in the same kind of tone and language when discussing my own practice. And that tone, which often emerges because one is gushing about some magical experience in circle, or relaying the intensity of an absolutely lacerating emotional experience, is one you can absolutely get away with when you're talking to people who do the kinds of things you do, who understand where you're coming from because they share experiences like that. It does not fly as well, though, with people who have never experienced anything like that. And not only does it not ring true or seem accessible to at least people I know who aren't engaged in pagan practices, I think it also makes most of them pretty uncomfortable. Now, to a certain extent, I understand why those sorts of styles would crop up in published materials. When speaking face-to-face with someone, we have the benefit of reframing the experience we're relaying in a way that is appropriate and palatable to the audience we're speaking to. But of course, an author doesn't get to do that with every reader. And so they pick a group to cater to and use whatever tone they think is appropriate for that group. And as happens from time to time, written materials that make a splash and that seem to break new ground tend to set the tone for all of the books that are similar to that one that follow, until like 90% of authors who write spiritual material are writing to that same subgroup that ate up the first book. And they keep writing that way, even though it's really unlikely that 90% of the people who are interested in these spiritual materials respond very positively to that style. For the rest of us who are looking for the kind of information that those writers are providing, we're left with little recourse but to choke down the prose. Another problem that I think is endemic is that a lot of authors assume a level of comfort with a way of thinking that I don't think comes naturally to most members of highly individualistic societies like we have in many Western countries, and particularly North America. Thinking of oneself as being highly connected not just to others but to nature isn't really the default mode in a lot of places. If anything, the mental distance and mental barriers between self and other that is common in many individualistic cultures is an exaggeration. And although it's true that a good chunk of people who are drawn to paganism will be responding to a desire to feel connected, that doesn't necessarily mean that that feeling is second nature to them already, or that those people take it as a given that feeling that connected is both possible and as fulfilling as many of us who've been engaged in this sort of practice for a long time have learned it is. And my use of the word learned here isn't trivial. There is a tendency that is essentially universal when it comes to expertise in pretty much any field or domain. And that is that people who know a great deal about something forget how little they used to know about that thing. And this is often discussed in the context of factual information, but applies as well to points of view and the means by which we process information, our way of thinking. And so most of us don't come to our practices with the same viewpoints as we now hold. They're ones we gained over time and with experience. But the majority of authors who are writing about this sort of path write as if they're communicating to people who already buy into that viewpoint. But just because you're interested in learning something doesn't mean you don't still need to be convinced, and certainly doesn't mean that you already see the world the same way those authors do. And so that difference in point of view can be not only jarring, but alienating. Because many of us do tend to hold the opinion that our general outlook is more or less fixed, is fairly deeply entwined with our personalities, rather than habits and the result of training, learning. And so rather than being a staircase that we can climb, any conflict with regards to outlook on some of the fundamentals like the nature of the universe looks like a major roadblock, perhaps even a barrier that's impossible to scale. In the same vein as this cultural disconnect regarding individualism, spiritual texts often display a strong, if not exclusive, focus on the use of affective arguments, that is, emotional arguments and language. This is, in a sense, unsurprising because many people's spiritual paths and spiritual focus is inherently inseparable from tending to one's emotional well-being and emotional enlightenment. And yet, the very heavy-handed use of emotional references, emotional adjectives, and arguments can give the impression that the more intellectual or cognitive aspects aren't there because they're really not there. And so the impression becomes the reason that so very little time is given to the argument that these sorts of spiritual practices can work, are feasible, do make sense, is that the book as a whole is basically bullshit. Now, I hope it goes without saying at this point that I don't believe that's true, and I imagine most of the people listening who do follow their own practices agree with me. But I absolutely understand when people get that impression, because I have only very, very rarely encountered appeals to logic in books on pagan spirituality that you can buy in a bookstore, whereas I encounter appeals to emotion very frequently. And that dichotomy is all the more striking because in every other context, certainly in my life, those ratios are reversed. In that people I'm having conversations with tend to lay out rational arguments in order to communicate ideas and concepts that are new to me, arguments that appeal to intellectual evaluation. And the point here is that I don't think there's any compelling reason to believe that you can't communicate new spiritual ideas, ideas about somebody's practice, things that they might be interested in trying in a less emotionally emphatic way, and in terms that sound accessible and reasonable. I mean, to be frank, this is partly why I began this channel. I find the intellectual and cognitive, psychological, neurological components of spirituality to be absolutely fascinating and wondrous. And yet I've certainly felt like there has generally been a dearth of that sort of conversation, of that focus. I am all for discussing what feels right, guiding one's practice. But I do think it's best not to forget that right feeling is generally built on a foundation of sounds plausible. And as is the case with most topics, the conspicuous absence of discussions centering on the feasibility or the sensibility of a behavior or approach is as good as an alarm call warning that there is no sense here. This isn't feasible. Thus, quite by accident, we frame our conversation about spirituality in such a way that we communicate defeat on those topics, on reason and sense. We give up that ground, even though there's really no need to. And yet, when you wander away from the bookstore and start delving into forums and on YouTube, you'll find that a shocking proportion of people who are engaged in pagan practices come at it from a background that is very humanist, very agnostic, very interested and aware of psychological processes. And based on my own experiences, and the fact that despite having only had a channel for about a month, I have received a lot of comments stating that my somewhat analytical approach to paganism is so refreshing. Clearly, this segment of the population is being underserved. And in my case, I didn't get over this hump regarding style. And what I saw is the credibility of a lot of pagan spiritual material until I realized that the core of my practice and the way in which I could engage with other people's practices was to question and understand them from a perception-focused paradigm. I had to realize that other people's stories about their practice and how they engage with their practice are really stories about their perceptions of how they engage with their practice. Any hypotheses they may also share about how these phenomena occur or are pulled off are just that. They're hypotheses. And I don't need to embrace those hypotheses in order to learn from their experiences or even apply their techniques. I can absolutely believe in their experiences without agreeing with them on how those experiences occurred. The underlying mechanism by which any of this stuff is happening doesn't really change anything else, isn't a problem, except when those hypotheses that we can't get behind end up obscuring the benefits that these people are talking about. The goal and the gold is the subjective experience. Ritual, magic, spellcraft are not solved games. We don't know how they work. This lack of understanding of the mechanism, I suspect, grates most of us at least a bit. But I think that for many of the more rationalist personalities listening, it becomes a sticking point. And those who really need to know how and why can get so caught up in the how and why that they, or frankly, we, don't really recognize or internalize the fact that it works. And so what'll happen is someone will relay a story to us that's filled with crystals, mystical seaweeds, all these details that we don't understand or don't see any inherent benefit to, and then wrap up the story by saying that this really complex thing that was done, well, left me feeling aces for the next week. And in fact, I was in such a great mood that I ended up throwing caution to the wind and asking out this person that I've been really sweet on. And being so hyper-focused on the mechanism, we hear all these references to things we're more naturally inclined to believing are probably trivial, and then sort of fret over that so much that we completely overlook the fact that regardless of whatever came before, that story ended with this person feeling awesome for a week and then getting laid. There was a punchline there, and we missed it. Now combine that tendency to have the real point of the tale, so easily obfuscated by any mechanistic suggestion that doesn't ring true for you, with the fact that the only people who are going to discuss mechanisms of spirituality and spellcraft in terms that do ring true for you are ones who will deliver those explanations, by and large, with extreme condescension as part of an explanation for why you shouldn't get involved with it. It's all crap of no value. Which is to say, people who are discussing potential mechanisms in an effort to debunk spiritual practices, because they too, being caught up in mechanism, are missing the point again. Now, this is not to say that there isn't a time and a place for debunking predatory bullshit, but most of our practices are not that. They're not about taking advantage of other people, quite the opposite. They're about serving ourselves and our best interests. And look, if you're one of these people who doesn't innately respond to material that is catering to naturally spiritual people, even if you were curious about this sort of spiritual practice, upon hearing a vicious, but on the plus side, hyper-rational takedown of spiritual reading material, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to sigh and back away from a spiritual path. Because the only people you're hearing speak a language that you read as sensible are the people telling you to stay away. So what can we do as people who have a tendency to value what sounds sensible and very rational, stuff that is hard and fast and demonstrable, if we're interested in pursuing a spiritual path that incorporates ritual, magic, witchcraft? Well, for one thing, I'd suggest not that you don't buy the Witchy 101 books, but that when you read them, resist the urge to chuck them across the room and focus instead on finding the punchlines, those personal anecdotes of spells and meaningful events in circle. What were the outcomes? What were the techniques that served to make those outcomes happen? Learn those, and don't worry so much about the details of the mechanism. because those things nobody really has an answer to, and the closest you'll get to one is the explanation you sort out for yourself later when you know enough to start cutting your way through the tall grass. I think it behooves us to keep in mind that different people have different learning styles, and in this case, that's essentially what we're talking about here. People whose skepticism is easily tweaked still probably want to know and should know about correspondences and visualization and astral work and all of the little techniques that go into a lot of our practices, or whatever practice they're trying to shape for themselves. But because they have a tendency towards skepticism, I certainly think that there are benefits to be had from using sources that go light on the overt mysticism. And I think that this is particularly important or beneficial at the beginning of one's journey, when one is still learning the basics of the craft. Because the truest litmus test of whether pursuing a spiritual path is going to be right for you is going to be what you get out of those experiences, those investigations. You have to get far enough that you start trying things in order to find out whether it's beneficial for you. And if it turns out that you decide it is a good thing for you, you will, with time, find a way to reconcile those conflicts that initially held you back. And I do believe that you can do this without ever needing to sacrifice on intellectual honesty. Which isn't to say you won't change your mind about a few things, because you probably will. But it'll be because you grew and learned, not because you gave in. As always, I welcome any comments or questions. I'd like to thank Gabrielle for tipping the scales in the direction of me posting this video. And until next time, I wish you all a wonderful night.